Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party holds its much-anticipated leadership contest on Wednesday. Running for the top position are Vaccine Minister Taro Kono, who previously served as former Defence and Foreign Minister, ex-Foreign Minister Fumio Kishida, former Internal Affairs Minister Sanae Takaichi, who is an ultra-conservative, and Seiko Noda, a liberal figure in the party. Whoever wins the race is set to become the country's next Prime Minister next month, as the LDP and its coalition partner hold a majority in the lower house. We discussed the odds and the implications for Japan's domestic politics and international affairs. And for this, we connect with Craig Mark, Professor of International Studies at Kyoritsu Women's University. Welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, thanks for having me.
And well, it looks like we've got an exciting day ahead of us, and it really looks like a toss-up between Taro Kono and Fumio Kishida right now. What would you say the strengths and weaknesses of these candidates are in this race?
Mr. Kono's main strength is that he's the most popular candidate among the general public and amongst the general branch members of the Liberal Democratic Party. His main weakness, though, is that he's not as popular amongst his colleagues in the Japanese Diet. And so Mr. Kishida has more potential to be supported by the fellow Diet members. However, his main weakness is that he's not as popular as Mr. Kono in the branches and in the general public. So if he wins, he's not going to be as welcomed by some.
Right, so Mr. Kono seems very media savvy and very popular, but Mr. Kishida, of course, he's seen as more of a neutral sort of bland figure, although he does enjoy a lot of support from his fellow lawmakers. But while some expect the election is going to result in a runoff between the top two candidates, and if that does become the case, then what kind of scenario are we going to see?
Well, it's expected that Mr. Kono will qualify fairly easily for the top spot, but it is actually a bit of a toss-up if Sanae Takaichi could actually make the second spot. There's still a number of undecided votes amongst the Diet members, and also nobody can be exactly sure where the branch members' votes are going to go. So it's an outside chance, but it is possible that it could be a runoff between Kono and Takaichi, although it will probably be Kono versus Kishida in the runoff. But whoever makes the runoff, Mr. Kono will have a challenge because the supporters of Takaichi will probably then shift their votes to support Mr. Kishida, or vice versa. So it's going to be a big challenge to see what's going to happen in the runoff immediately after the first vote.
Right, well, all four candidates, they seem to want to go through with Japan's constitutional reform, and they're all promising future-oriented policies. Now, what does that mean, and what will they be prioritising?
Constitutional reform means having a referendum to alter the constitution, particularly Article 9, to have it mentioned in the Constitution. That doesn't have much popular support, so that would be probably delayed, even whoever wins. However, all candidates are committed to increasing military spending on the self-defense forces, and the challenge will be to maintain smooth relations with China. All candidates are supporting Taiwan to enter the TPP trade treaty. But the other main challenge is on domestic policy, particularly boosting the economy after the pandemic. And Sanae Takaichi basically wants to continue Abenomics, the policies of previous Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. But both Mr. Kishida and Mr. Kono are talking about addressing income inequality, because income inequality has worsened over the past 9 years in Japan. And all candidates want to support nuclear power. Mr. Kono has frequently in the past talked about phasing it out, but to address climate change, all the candidates are now saying Japan needs to continue operating its nuclear power plants.
While many don't expect the LDP to go through any dramatic changes, regardless of who the next leader will be, there have been some clashes among the candidates, though, over some societal values such as same-sex marriage and married couples having different surnames. Do you expect to see any real progress on these kind of issues?
Well, it depends who wins. Mr. Kono and the more liberal candidate, Seiko Noda, who doesn't really have a chance at all, they're both in favour of same-sex marriage, and they're both in favour of allowing women to choose their family names once they get married. Because under current Japanese law, married couples have to have the same surname. A husband could choose his wife's family name, but it's almost always the wife choosing the husband's name. And also, female succession is another issue as well. Both Mr. Kono and Ms. Noda are in favour of allowing women to ascend to the imperial throne, which is a bit of a pressing issue for the shrinking royal family. But Mr. Kishida and Takeichi are against same-sex marriage, and they're against allowing women to choose their own family name, and they're against female succession to the imperial family. So we'll see what happens, whoever becomes the leader on those social issues.
Right, but obviously the priority is going to be on recovering from the pandemic and, as you said, rolling out those economic revitalization plans. And well, in terms of foreign relations, now Seoul-Tokyo relations, they've been frosty at best for the last few years, and there's been very little interaction between the two governments during Mr. Suga's term. Now, Taro Kono, unlike his father, he's shown a rather hardline stance against Japan's wartime atrocities. He's shown a rather unapologetic sort of attitude towards issues concerning Japan's wartime atrocities, especially the forced sexual enslavement of Korean women. He said earlier this month that he's going to follow the LDP's stance on history. So what is their stance really, and what will the next lead? And do you think the next leader is going to be willing to cooperate with Seoul on these common regional challenges that they share?
Yes, Mr. Kono is very much different from his father, who issued the famous Kono Statement in 1993, apologising for Japan's wartime record. All the major candidates, particularly regarding the Yasukuni Shrine, they're in favour of visiting, although Mr. Kono has said he won't visit if he's Prime Minister. Ms. Noda is also against visiting. As far as relations with Korea go, there was, of course, a bit of hope last week when the foreign ministers, Mr. Motegi of Japan and Mr. Chung Ye-young of South Korea, met at the sidelines of the UN General Assembly meeting. And there might be prospects for improvement depending on next year's elections in South Korea, actually. I think whoever becomes Prime Minister of Japan will probably be waiting for next year for there to be a circuit breaker. But there are obviously the disputes over the compensation for slave labour during the war. I noticed the court cases in Korea are still going against the Japanese companies like Mitsubishi. Of course, there's the territorial islands dispute over the Dokdo Islands, which Japan claims is the Takeshima Islands. Seems to be no prospect of that being resolved. But at least there is potential for some improvement happening depending on the political outcomes next year. Interestingly, all candidates have said they're willing to hold a summit with Kim Jong-un in North Korea to try and resolve tensions between Japan and North Korea. Of course, the North Koreans tested a set of missiles yesterday, and well, we'll have to see if anything comes out of that. It's doubtful so far, but well.
Of course, North Korea is one of the key issues that South Korea and Japan face together, especially with Japanese nationals having been adopted by North Korea. And well, we will have to see how bilateral relations turn out after South Korea's presidential election next year, as you mentioned. But well, beginning with Japan's own election first, of Of course, there's the parliamentary election coming up very soon, as the members of the House of Representatives, their terms are going to end in a couple of weeks. But, well, first, this LDP election. Now, considering that Yoshihide Suga, he started this term with a high level of popularity, it seems that the next leader might have to face the revolving door of Japanese politics if they don't deliver. How do you think the next leader is going to have to prove himself or herself?
Well, the main challenge will be recovering the economy and leading Japan out of the pandemic. It was announced by Mr. Suga in his final press conference last night that the states of emergency in all the major cities of Japan will be allowed to expire at the end of this month, and so people can gradually start going out more, particularly as vaccination rates still increase. Most of the country now has been double vaccinated. But we'll see how it goes into next year. If the economy remains flat, if wages continue to stagnate, that's going to be a big challenge for whoever is Prime Minister. And if their popularity drops and, well, if there's a potential political scandal which emerges, that dogged Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's administration from time to time, then there could be pressure on a Prime Minister in future to resign early, like Mr. Suga had done. But we'll have to see what happens with the election, which is due to be called probably early November, either November the 7th or November the 14th, since elections are held on Sundays in Japan. The new Prime Minister will be formally sworn in on Monday, and then they'll choose their cabinet, and they're widely expected to call the election very soon after that.
And well, it does seem that the front runners here are very obvious, either Mr. Kono or Mr. Kishida, but it's been a very interesting race because they had the two female candidates running this year. And well, with Sane Tokashi, the former Internal Affairs Minister, and Seiko Noda running as candidates, some observers consider this as progress for the ruling party. But do you think this indicates a true change for the advancement of women in Japanese politics?
Yes, it is an indication that things are changing somewhat. Of course, we'll have to wait and see if that actually happens on a broader scale. Currently, only around 10% of the lower house of the parliament are women, a bit better in the upper house, it's around 25%. And, but we'll have to see how many candidates that the parties put up, both the Liberal Democratic Party and the main opposition party, the Constitutional Democratic Party. If Sane Takaichi wins today, then she will be Japan's first female Prime Minister, which will be very historic. Although she herself is certainly not a feminist. She's very conservative on so-called traditional family values and other areas. But, well, we'll have to wait and see. It could be the beginning of a bit of a broader change, which is having more demands in China, in Japan, from women in society.
And as you said, Seiko Noda stands very little chance of being any close to winning the election, but there's been a great amount of attention on Ms. Takaichi, though, because of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's strong support for her. Why do you think the former leader decided to back her?
Well, she's the closest to him ideologically. Mr. Abe only visited Taka Yasukuni Shrine once when he was early on as Prime Minister, and that caused a whole lot of diplomatic controversy. Ms. Takaichi said she'll visit as much as she wants, and she's very much aligned with the ultra-nationalist, hardcore conservatives wing of the Liberal Democratic Party. So Shinzo Abe and her are very closely ideologically aligned, and plus he would have the kudos of backing the first female Prime Minister if that eventuates.
Right, and well, next month the House of Representatives members' terms end on the 21st. But, well, even with the perceived failure of the government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic and their lack of innovation when it comes to the economy and social policies, do you still see this one-party politics system in Japan continuing for the foreseeable future?
Yes, for the short term at least for this upcoming election. The Constitutional Democratic Party has finally started to get its act together a bit. They've formed an agreement with the smaller opposition parties, particularly the Japanese Communist Party, to not run against each other in the lower house seats, so that maximizes their chances of getting more seats from the Liberal Democratic Party. And the leader of the Constitutional Democratic Party, Yukio Adano, this week announced a very radical populist policy of cutting the consumption tax from 10 to 5% and cutting income tax for everyone earning less than 10 million yen a year, which is about $120,000 a year. So it's nearly everyone. But it will depend a lot on who is the LDP's leader. If Mr. Kono runs, given his wider public popularity, it'll be much harder for the opposition to reduce the two-thirds majority that the LDP currently enjoys. If it's Mr. Kishida or Ms. Takeichi, who is far less popular, then the opposition does have a better chance to reduce that supermajority to a much smaller majority. But it's unlikely to return to a two-party system of frequent exchanges of government, which isn't very good for Japanese democracy. The last time a change of government happened was 2009, and the opposition was only in power for 3 short, turbulent years. So it could be until 2025 until there's a change of government in Japan.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. That was Craig Mark, Professor of International Studies at Kyoritsu Women's University. Thank you so much for your insights today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.